So, should we expect a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? Let's try to figure this out with Lyudmila Pokroschuk, PhD, an expert in foreign and domestic policy. Ms. Lyudmila, welcome.
Hello.
Ms. Lyudmila, so Russia is threatening to deploy new missiles in Cuba. In your opinion, is this a real intention, or is it just classic Kremlin-style saber rattling and raising the stakes?
Well, since Russia tries to emulate the Soviet Union and in principle always claims to be its successor, of course, they would like to be seen as the Soviet Union was, as that country, that bloc, which was part of the bipolar model that existed in the 20th century. But today we can see, in reality, what Russia represents is, of course, not the Soviet Union at all, but it wants to be like that. That's why we see that their statements are more like raising the stakes, because we need to understand what the deployment of their weapons actually means. For example, back in 2016, Russia was also talking about this during negotiations with the US. At that time, it was also a matter of escalation. The issue back then concerned NATO expansion. And at that time, they noted that even if NATO were to expand, they would deploy some of their weapons, nuclear weapons, placing them in Venezuela and in Cuba. I would also like to point out that in 2022, in January, on the eve of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, by the way, there were negotiations in Vienna at that time. The United States was involved in those talks, as well as the EU and the OCE. And by the way, Ukraine was invited then. And at that time, Lavrov also noted that if NATO were to expand, they would deploy their nuclear weapons in Venezuela and Cuba. And today, we see a similar statement being made. By the way, neither in 2016 nor in 2022 did they actually deploy them. It was all just talk at the level of statements. Because Russia, yes, it can talk a lot, it can rattle its nuclear weapons. By the way, basically, that's the only issue it has left. That's the only thing they can discuss with the American side, because when it comes to negotiations with the US, apart from nuclear weapons, they have no other cards to play at this point. Because economically, Ukraine, well, the Russian Federation is very weak. I'll also point out that economically, it has nothing to offer the countries of Latin America, especially to Cuba and Venezuela. Yes, their trade turnover with Venezuela increased by 64% in 2024, but it only amounts to 300 million. For comparison, if you look at China, it's 17.1 billion. The same goes for Cuba. With Cuba, it's 400 million. So what exactly can it offer? Yes, all it can offer is this military component it keeps talking about. But both Venezuela and Cuba, I think, understand very well what the possible consequences could be. Although Maduro, as we know, appealed to the Russian Federation. By the way, he didn't just reach out to Russia, he also approached Iran and China. And with Russia, they have a strategic partnership agreement, which was signed in May of this year. Nevertheless, they are quite cautious when it comes to statements, especially regarding nuclear weapons. As for the nuclear weapons of the Russian Federation, they understand that America could indeed take certain measures, as such levers could be used, that it wouldn't just be a Cuban Missile Crisis for the Russian Federation, it would be something entirely different. The situation could spiral out of control, considering that Venezuela itself is facing a very complicated political situation, and Cuba is also experiencing political difficulties due to their economies. Since, after all, we should note, these are not wealthy countries. And now Russia is taking advantage of this crisis that has arisen in the Caribbean basin, the one happening right now. They are using it purely for their own benefit. Why? Because, as I understand it, they need to talk to the Americans. At present, they have lost the initiative they once had. Let me point out the one they even had in Alaska, when negotiations took place between Trump and Putin. And also today, they need these negotiations because they need to somehow understand the issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war. What next? How will the American side move forward in this direction? What will be the corridor of Trump's further actions? They don't understand this. And today we see statements from Lavrov, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry. What is he saying? He keeps saying that, yes, we need to resume negotiations with the American side. We also see his deputy Ushakov, as well as Putin's advisor, saying that negotiations are also needed by the United States, and they are trying to revive this negotiation track. But how do you revive the negotiation track? As I keep saying, what is there to talk about? That's why they're raising the stakes on the nuclear issue. where there is a crisis, and right now the country involved in this crisis is the United States. And now they are trying to raise these stakes specifically through Venezuela and Cuba in order to enter into negotiations with the United States. And these negotiations will concern the Russian-Ukrainian war. That's why, as I said, you might wonder, what do the Caribbean basin have to do with the Russian-Ukrainian war? But for Russia, these two tracks, these two issues are completely interconnected, because I believe a conversation must take place, and they want bilateral negotiations to happen. So as I said, for now, yes, they are raising the stakes. They are not going to deploy their nuclear weapons there, because deploying nuclear weapons would completely nullify US legislation, which currently gives them a free hand. This is the Monroe Doctrine, established in 1903, which stated that no weapons can be present on the American continent, neither in North nor in Latin America. And this would even be considered an attack on the United States. Russia is well aware of this law. It has been extended, and they understand this very well. The countries of Latin America, that's why, as I said, let me note that today Russia is indeed raising the stakes, and it will continue to do so until the American side responds. Well, as we can see, so far Trump is not responding either. Trump is also holding a pause, watching to see what will happen next. But what does Russia really have? Yes, it has a nuclear triad, and so do the United States. But I must point out that when it comes to nuclear weapons, the United States arsenal is more technologically advanced and more modernized. Because when it comes to Russian nuclear weapons, we don't really know how much they've been modernized. Although I should note, according to the new strategy adopted by the Russian Federation, they did state that they are fully modernizing their triad. However, considering the sanctions imposed on them since 2022, and I would even say since 2014, but specifically the technological sanctions that were introduced in 2022, this is an important factor. So it's hard to say how much they've actually managed to modernize it, because this information is classified and not accessible. Therefore, we can basically say that Russia, as always, is a country that tends to blow things out of proportion. And the bigger this bubble is, the more it suggests that it's a country with agency, that it can talk about things, that it can negotiate about something. But I would note, if we take a closer look at what it actually has. In reality, today in the Russian Federation, apart from talk about nuclear weapons, there is really nothing else. In other words, they have nothing to offer the world. They can't offer an economy, no economic aspects at all. Yes, they do sell minerals to Latin America, but basically that's 35%. It is minerals, I should note. The rest, well, those are all minor categories. And as for anything else, yes, they do sell military arms to Venezuela. I'll note that there really is a greater Russian component there than American or European, but it's still a small amount overall. And beyond that, basically, there's nothing else. As for China's presence in Latin America, yes, if we look at who really has influence in Latin America, it's China. Because let me point out, the trade turnover, even China's trade with Latin American countries, amounts to $500 billion. And we still need to understand that since Trump's first term, China has made a great effort to enter the economies of Latin American countries. And even today, for Russia to even talk to Latin American countries, it would have to do so through China, I should note. That's why, as I said, they understand this well today and are trying to save face. Because the situation with the Russian-Ukrainian war is becoming much more complicated for them now. It's a difficult situation, especially due to their lack of understanding of the American side. How will the American side act? What other sanctions might there be? Although we see that Marco Rubio has stated that certain sanctions have already been imposed, they understand that there could be more. But, you know, in the end, the final word always belongs to Trump, to the president of the United States. And considering that even the sanctions Trump imposed on the Russian Federation, on their oil companies, were rather restrained sanctions, as it was said, the middle option that was proposed to Trump. So we know that there is an even tougher option. If Russia continues to try to blackmail the United States, and in this case Trump, by blackmailing Venezuela and Cuba, then considering the historical aspect of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis that took place back then, I think Trump will really not like that at all. And of course, Russia could face sanctions that they would absolutely not want, because this could be a certain kind of embargo, I should note. Specifically an energy embargo, which we all talk about, and which even Japan, for example, pointed out last year. So, as I said, we'll see how Russia continues to rattle its nuclear weapons. But as I understand it, aside from talk, so far we haven't seen anything else from them. And in principle, I don't think we'll see anything from them, because to escalate to nuclear conflict with the US, I don't think Putin will go that far. After all, he can say a lot, but such a move would mean starting a nuclear war with the US. The Russian Federation simply does not have nearly enough strength or capability for a nuclear war.
Ms. Lyudmila, thank you very much for such a detailed answer. I heard a lot of interesting information from you. I hope we will continue to talk with you on air to hear even more information from you. Of course, we will be waiting for the reaction of the United States to this threat, because so far we really haven't seen one. Let me remind you that we were joined by Lyudmila Pokroschuk, Doctor of Philosophy and expert in external and internal policies. Thank you very much.